A solitary Apache finds a baby forgotten in a suitcase, and with it, a woman marked by secrets and forbidden to his eyes. The desert doesn't forgive dangerous desires, but who can resist a love that defies everything? If intense and unexpected love stories like this touch your heart, subscribe to this channel and comment what you thought. Every day we post new plots that move and surprise. Discover now the romance that no one dared to live. In the arid heart of Arizona's desert, where the scorching sun transforms the red earth into embers, and the wind carries promises of rain that never come, Jake lives on the margins of two worlds that insist on rejecting him. Son of an Apache mother and a rancher father, he is a silent survivor of a society that doesn't know where to place him. At 40 years old, he's known for his skill with wild horses and his harshness with words. A man who carries invisible scars in his dark eyes and an ancestral heritage that weighs on his shoulders like armor. Since youth, he learned that desiring what is not his is opening the door to ruin, and so he desires nothing, or so he believed. On that suffocating March afternoon, returning from fishing at the Colorado River, Jake spots an old suitcase by the dirt road, alone, like an artifact forgotten by time. Something in him, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps an ancestral warning whispered by the winds, makes him dismount his horse and open the rusty latch. The sound of creaking metal mingles with a low cry, contained, almost resigned. Among hand-embroidered blankets, a newborn baby stares at him with eyes as clear as crystalline water, a brutal contrast to the reddened earth around. Jake feels his chest contract in a way he hasn't felt in years. Without knowing exactly why, he takes the child with him to the reservation, determined to hand it over to the authorities the next day. But that same night, a figure emerges from the darkness, like a ghost made of silk and dust. A black car with dark windows stops in front of his simple adobe house, and from it emerges a breathless woman with disheveled blonde hair and green eyes wide with fear. The heel of her shoes sinks into the sand as she runs toward the baby, lying on the blanket in an improvised basket. She is tall, with delicate yet hurried gestures, and her voice breaks when she pronounces a name he doesn't understand. Then, she raises her eyes to him with something between plea and defiance and says, with a southern accent that completely clashes with that place, "I'm Sarah Mitchell. That child is mine, and you have no idea what you're doing." Jake knows exactly who the Mitchell family is. The newspapers are full of her father's face, senator, owner of immense ranches, controller of half the agribusiness in the Southwest. She shouldn't be there, in that territory forgotten by maps, much less looking at him with that fire in her eyes. But when Sarah holds the baby back in her arms, trembling, something in the way she envelops it reveals that her story is full of cracks. Jake's instinct tells him to let her go, but she doesn't go. That night, she can't get away. And the next night, she returns. The excuse is the baby. Too fragile for long journeys, she says. Better to keep him on the reservation for now, she says. But in the green eyes there is something else, a fear that goes beyond the child's health. And each night she spends there, sitting at Jake's rustic table, sharing sugar bread and the heavy silence of the desert, the tension between them intensifies like a storm in the hot air of the Badlands. She observes his hands, strong and rough, as he rolls a straw cigarette with the precision of a ritual. He observes her hair tied in an improvised bun, the curve of her neck, the subtle blush that rises to her face when their fingers touch while caring for the baby. Sarah smells of expensive perfume and desperation. Her fine clothes are wrinkled, her shoes covered in red dust. She should be in Washington at some political dinner, smiling for the cameras alongside her husband. But she's there, in the middle of nowhere, watching Jake prepare an herbal tea for the baby with the same delicacy with which he treats newborn colts. There is a brutal gentleness in that man, a contained strength that makes her feel safe for the first time in years. On the third night, they meet alone under the stars, in the shadow of a centennial oak tree. Sarah is intoxicated by homemade whiskey, by desperation, by desire growing like a weed in her chest. Before he can stop her, she kisses him. A hot, hungry kiss that Jake doesn't have the strength to refuse. It's a mistake, they both know, but neither retreats. And when they pull away, breathless, the baby cries in the basket, like a cruel reminder that none of that should be happening. What happens next is inevitable. Each night becomes a dangerous game. Each gesture carries second intentions. She appears in dresses too light for the cold of the desert dawn, sits too close to him by the fire, lets his fingers linger too long on hers when she passes him the cup of herbal tea. He, in turn, feels control unravel with each prolonged look. With each warm breath she releases near his ear, when she murmurs his name with that accent that drives him crazy. In the darkness, between skins and improvised sheets, they finally surrender, and the carnal love they make under the faint moonlight is both brutal and delicate, a meeting of souls and bodies that leaves them marked forever. Sarah moans softly, her nails dug into his broad back, while Jake takes her with a passion he didn't know still existed within him. She is fire and silk. He is earth and brute force. Together, they create a fire that threatens to consume everything around. But the world doesn't forgive those who dare to break the rules. Days later, Sarah's husband, an ambitious lawyer with a cruel smile, arrives at the reservation with 2 police officers at his side, demanding that his wife return home and take with her the shame she carries in her arms. He shows court orders and threatens Jake with arrest. Tension explodes like gunpowder. Jake confronts the men with clenched fists. Sarah clings to his shirt as if he were her only anchor. "This woman isn't going anywhere," says Jake, his voice low and dangerous. "Not while I'm alive." The husband laughs, a cutting sound like broken glass. "You don't know who you're messing with, Indian. My wife is a Mitchell. You are nothing." The words cut like a blade, but Jake doesn't back down. He takes Sarah away from there, riding through the desert fields, to a secret refuge where only the ancestral spirits would watch them. It's an abandoned house built of mud and sticks, hidden among yellow cottonwoods and mesquite trees. There, away from the world, they love each other with the desperation of those who know that time is running out. It is in the silence of that hideout that Sarah finally confesses the darkest secret. The baby is not her husband's child. It is not the fruit of an extramarital affair. It is the fruit of a monstrous violence committed by her own father, a dirty secret that she tried to erase by fleeing to the only place where no one would dare look for her. Senator Edward Mitchell, the man who appears in newspapers as a defender of the American family, is a monster who abused his own daughter for years. Hearing this, Jake takes her in his arms and loves her as if trying to return a piece of her lost soul. A love that is both tenderness and fury, an almost sacred rite under the desert stars. He whispers words in Apache that she doesn't understand, but that sound like promises of protection, like ancestral vows. But fate is crueler than either imagines. Rumors run fast through the interior, threats multiply. The small community begins to murmur that he betrayed his blood by welcoming a rich white woman marked by scandal. And that dawn, when they believe they've found a moment of peace, a gunshot tears through the silence, echoing through the Badlands. Jake runs to the house where Sarah is, only to find her trembling, on her knees on the ground, with a blood-stained letter in her hands. She raises her eyes to him, desperate, and whispers through tears, "They discovered everything. There's no going back." And as the wind howls outside, raising the red dust like a lament of the ancestors, both know that there begins the most devastating battle, between honor and desire, between love and survival, between the past that binds them and the future they may never have together. Because some love stories don't ask permission to exist, but they charge a price that not everyone has the courage to pay. The letter trembled in Sarah's blood-stained hands like a dry leaf in the wind. The words written in red ink seemed to jump from the paper, each letter a threat, each sentence a death sentence. Jake tore the paper from her hands and read aloud, his voice cutting through the dawn silence like a sharp blade. "You have 24 hours to return my property, damned Indian. The whore and the bastard belong to me. If you don't obey, I'll burn everything you love, starting with your reservation." The signature was a simple E.M. Edward Mitchell. The senator didn't even sign his threats with his full name, as if even that was too much power to grant someone like Jake. The paper was stained with blood, and by the metallic smell that permeated the air, Jake knew it wasn't ink. Someone had died to deliver that message. Sarah collapsed on the beaten earth floor, sobs echoing through the small mud house. The baby, as if sensing his mother's despair, began to cry too, a sharp sound that pierced the night like an omen. Jake knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands enveloping the delicate face that was now swollen with tears. "He's going to kill me," she whispered, her voice broken. "He'll kill the child too. We can't escape him, Jake. He has too much power, too much money. We're just insects to him." Jake felt anger grow in his chest like an uncontrolled fire. It wasn't just anger at what Edward was doing now, but at everything he had done before. For every night Sarah spent in silence, suffering at the hands of her own father. For every time she had to smile for the cameras, pretending to be the perfect daughter of a man who was a monster. For every invisible scar she carried in her soul. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "No one will touch you while I'm alive. Not him, not anyone. Do you understand me?" Sarah looked at him through her tears, seeing something in his dark eyes that made her stop crying. It was a fierce, primitive determination, as if all the ancestral protective instincts had awakened at once. Jake wasn't just a man in love. He was a warrior, and she had just become his cause. "But how?" she asked, her voice weak. "He has the police in his pocket, bought judges, politicians who owe favors. We have nothing. We have the truth," Jake replied, standing up and starting to pace. "And we have allies he doesn't even imagine exist." He was thinking of the network of contacts he had built over the years. Not corrupt politicians or greedy businessmen, but real people. Honest journalists who still believed in the power of the press. Indigenous activists who knew the legal paths to protect the oppressed. Small ranchers who hated the monopoly of large landowners. And especially, his own people, who knew what it meant to be hunted by those who considered themselves superior. The sound of approaching engines cut his thoughts. Jake ran to the window and saw the headlights piercing the darkness. 3 black cars, identical to the one Sarah had driven days before. The senator wasn't bluffing. He had sent his thugs after them. "Take the child," he said, his voice urgent. "We'll go out the back." But it was too late. The cars had already surrounded the house, and male voices shouted orders from outside. Jake recognized the voice of Sarah's husband, Robert Taylor, a man who had sold his soul in exchange for a position in the government and access to Mitchell money. "Sarah, come out now, or we'll come in by force." Jake pulled an old shotgun from under the bed and checked if it was loaded. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. Sarah huddled in the corner, holding the baby against her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "I won't let them take me," she whispered. "I'd rather die here, with you, than go back to that hell." Her words hit him like a punch in the stomach. Jake realized she was serious. There was a dark determination in her eyes, as if she had already made the final decision. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't lose the only woman who had managed to touch his soul after so long. "Look at me," he said, dropping the shotgun and holding her face with both hands. "You are not going to die. We will get out of here and we will fight. But first, I need you to trust me." Outside, the sound of footsteps approached. Jake could hear the men talking, planning the invasion. They weren't just ordinary thugs. By the way they moved, they were professionals, probably ex-military or ex-police who now worked for whoever paid more. Jake knew the house like the palm of his hand. There was a trap door in the kitchen floor, built decades ago by some previous owner who also had his secrets. He took Sarah and the baby there, moved the tattered rug and lifted the loose board. Underneath was a narrow tunnel, dug in the red earth, that led to an abandoned well a few meters from the house. "Keep moving," he whispered. "When you get to the other side, wait for me. I'll distract them and meet you." Sarah hesitated, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "What if they kill you?" "They won't," he replied, with a confidence he didn't completely feel. "They want me alive. Dead, I can't deliver you to them." She kissed him then, a desperate kiss, full of fear and love and farewell. Then she went down through the tunnel, the baby in her arms, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. Jake returned to the main room, picked up the shotgun, and opened the front door. The men were positioned in a semicircle, weapons pointed at him. Robert Taylor was in the center, his expensive suit incongruous in that scene of imminent violence. "Where is my wife?" he asked, his voice cold as ice. "What wife?" Jake replied, feigning ignorance. "There's only me and my dog here." Robert signaled and 2 men entered the house, searching each room. Jake knew they would soon discover the trapdoor, but every second he gained was one more second for Sarah to get away. "You're playing with fire, Indian," Robert said, approaching. "Do you know who my father-in-law is? Do you know what he's capable of?" "I know he's a rapist," Jake replied, seeing the satisfaction in the other man's eyes turn to fury. "I know he abused his own daughter and now wants to hide it because he's afraid of losing power." The slap came quickly, but Jake was expecting it. He dodged and landed a punch in Robert's stomach, who doubled over in pain. Immediately, the other men moved, but Jake was already running toward the back of the house, leading them away from the tunnel. The chase through the desert fields was brutal. Jake knew every rock, every tree, every hole in the terrain. But there were many men, and they had powerful flashlights and modern equipment. He managed to shake them off for almost an hour, running among the cottonwoods and hiding behind giant ant hills. But eventually he was surrounded in a clearing near the river. "Playtime's over," said one of the men, pointing a pistol at his head. "Now you're going to tell us where she is." Jake spat blood on the ground. During the chase, he had taken some blows and his face was swollen, but he smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She's already far from here," he lied. "You'll never find her." The pistol whipping threw him to the ground, making him see stars. But even with pain exploding in his head, Jake kept smiling. Every minute he spent there getting beaten was a minute Sarah gained to escape. That's when he heard the sound he had been waiting for. A sharp cry coming from the direction of the house. One of the men had found the tunnel and was shouting to the others. Jake felt his stomach contract. If Sarah was still in the tunnel, she would be captured. "Seems like your girlfriend wasn't as smart as you thought," Robert said, appearing in the clearing with the phone in his hand. "My men just found the hideout. She's coming home, where she belongs." Jake tried to get up, but a boot kicked him back to the ground. The anger he felt was so intense it almost blinded him. Imagining Sarah being dragged back to hell, imagining the baby being raised by those monsters, was more than he could bear. "You don't understand," he said, spitting more blood. "She will never stop running. No matter how many times you bring her back, she will always try to escape, because she would rather die than live with you." "Then maybe that's what we'll do," Robert replied, his voice icy. "Maybe it's time for her to learn that some lessons are permanent." His words contained a veiled threat that made Jake's blood freeze. They weren't just planning to take Sarah back. They were planning to hurt her in a way that she would never be able to run away again. Perhaps an accident that would leave her crippled, or worse, that would hurt the baby to make her more docile. Jake closed his eyes and said a prayer to the spirits of his ancestors. He asked for strength, asked for protection for Sarah and the child, asked for a chance to save them. And when he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them. A fierce, primitive determination that made even the armed men take a step back. "You made a mistake," he said, rising slowly, despite the weapons pointed at him. "You threatened my woman and my son, and now you're going to pay for it." The bullet that pierced his shoulder made him stagger, but not stop. Jake kept walking toward the men, as if he were invincible, as if he were protected by the spirits of the forest. The second bullet hit his thigh, and he fell to his knees, but it was at that moment that the miracle happened. Lights came on around the clearing, and voices shouted in English and Apache. The entire community had come after him, armed with machetes, old shotguns, and an ancestral fury that made the air vibrate. Among them was Sarah, the baby in her arms, her eyes shining with tears of relief. She had managed to escape from the tunnel and run to the reservation, asking for help, and his people, who had learned to protect their own against invaders for centuries, had answered the call. "Now," said Jake, smiling through the pain, "let's talk again." The circle of flashlights transformed the clearing into an improvised stage where two worlds faced off. On one side, men in dirty suits and shiny weapons, representing the power of money and corruption. On the other, dozens of community residents, with their simple clothes and work tools transformed into instruments of protection. Among them was Sarah, the baby clutched to her chest, her green eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination that Jake had never seen before. Robert Taylor looked around, quickly calculating the odds. His men were well-trained and well-armed, but they were clearly outnumbered. And there was something in the way the residents stared at them that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't just anger. It was the ancestral fury of a people who had learned to defend their own against invaders over generations. "This is none of your business," he shouted, trying to regain control of the situation. "This woman is my wife. It's a family matter." "Family doesn't hurt family," replied a hoarse voice from the crowd. It was Martha, the oldest midwife in the community, a woman of nearly 80 who had helped bring half the children there into the world. She advanced a few steps, leaning on a wooden cane, but with her black eyes shining in a way that made even the armed thugs retreat. "Family protects. What you do is something else." Jake tried to stand up, blood flowing from his wounded shoulder, but Sarah ran to him before he could fall again. She knelt beside him, putting an arm around his waist to support him. The baby still nestled in her other arm. The simple gesture spoke louder than any word. There was a woman who had chosen her side, who had abandoned all the comfort and security of her previous life to be with him. "You're losing a lot of blood," she whispered, examining the wounds. She had studied medicine before being forced to abandon her studies to get married, and knew that the bullet in the shoulder had passed clean through, but the one in the thigh was lodged in the muscle. "You need medical attention. First, let's resolve this," he replied, staring fixedly at Robert. "Then I'll worry about the holes." Two of the residents approached and helped Jake to stand. They were twin brothers, Jack and Joe, who worked as cowboys on a nearby ranch and had known Jake since childhood. They held him by the arms, allowing him to stand upright despite his wounds. "Now let's talk like civilized men," said Jake, his voice firm despite the pain. "You are going to leave here, and you are not going to bother this woman anymore. She has made her choice." Robert laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the clearing. "You really think you can intimidate me with this bunch of nobodies? I represent Senator Edward Mitchell. He owns lands you can't even imagine. He has politicians, judges, and police in his pocket. You are nothing." "Maybe," said a new voice, calm and educated, coming from the edge of the clearing. "But we have something your father-in-law doesn't have. We have the truth." Everyone turned to see a young man emerging from the darkness, carrying a professional camera and a recorder. He was dark-haired, wearing glasses, dressed in jeans and a simple button-up shirt. He didn't look threatening, but there was something about his presence that made the thugs tense. "My name is Daniel Rodriguez," he said, approaching the group. "I'm an investigative journalist with Truth America, and for 3 months I've been investigating the illegal activities of the Mitchell family." Robert visibly paled. "You have no right to be here. This is private property." "Actually," Daniel replied, consulting a paper he took from his pocket, "according to county records, this land has belonged to the community for more than 50 years. You are the trespassers here." He turned to Sarah, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and distrust. "Mrs. Mitchell, I would very much like to talk to you. There are several people who are willing to testify about what your father did. Not just to you, but to other victims. Women who have been silent for years but who now want to speak." His words fell over the clearing like a bomb. Sarah felt her legs weaken and Jake held her tighter, ignoring the pain of his own wounds. Other victims. She had always suspected she wasn't the only one, but hearing the confirmation out loud was like receiving a punch in the stomach. "How many?" she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "At least 7 that we've found so far," Daniel replied gently. "Ranch employees, daughters of workers, a cousin of yours who lives abroad, all with similar stories, all afraid to speak because he is too powerful." Robert made an abrupt gesture to his men, who immediately pointed their weapons at the journalist. "You're not going anywhere with that camera." But Daniel smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can kill me here, but that won't stop the report. It's already ready. I'm just waiting for Mrs. Mitchell's testimony to complete the investigation. If anything happens to me tonight, the story will be published tomorrow morning, with or without her testimony." The tension in the clearing grew even thicker. Jake could feel the desperation of Robert's men. They had come there expecting a simple operation: take a defenseless woman and bring her back home. They didn't expect to find an entire community willing to protect her, nor an investigative journalist with evidence that could destroy the entire Mitchell family. "Sarah," said Jake, turning to her, "the choice is yours. It always has been. But now you have a chance to do more than just escape. You can help prevent him from doing this to other people." She looked into his eyes, seeing there the strength she had learned to love. Jake had never tried to influence or control her. From the first day, he had respected her choices, even when those choices put them in danger. It was the complete opposite of the men who had controlled her life until then. "I will speak," she said, her voice gaining firmness with each word. "I will tell everything. About my father, about the years of abuse, about how I was forced to marry to hide the pregnancy. Everything." Robert stepped forward, his face contorted with rage. "You have no idea what you're doing, Sarah. If you speak, it won't just be your father who will fall. It will be our entire family, my career, our businesses, everything. And I won't let that happen." He signaled to one of his men, who immediately pointed his gun at the baby in Sarah's arms. The gesture was too quick for anyone to prevent, but slow enough for everyone to understand the threat. "One word about our family affairs, and your little bastard will have an accident," Robert said, his voice icy. "Babies are so fragile. They can die from so many things." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. Sarah hugged her son tighter, her eyes wide with horror. Jake felt a fury so intense that for a moment he completely forgot about the pain of his wounds. It was Martha who broke the silence. The old midwife advanced a few more steps, hitting her cane on the ground with force. "Stupid boy," she said, her voice loaded with contempt. "You think you can threaten a child in front of us? You think we're cowards like you?" She looked around at the other residents, and Jake saw something that filled him with pride. There was no fear in the eyes of his people. There was determination. There was the same fury he felt, multiplied by dozens of people who had decided that some lines couldn't be crossed. "Listen well, you expensive suit piece of shit," Martha continued, pointing her cane at Robert. "You came to our home, threatened our people, hurt our boy, and now you're pointing a gun at a baby. You know what that makes you? A rabid dog that needs to be put down." What happened next was too fast for any of the thugs to react. Jack and Joe released Jake and moved like lightning, disarming the man who was pointing the gun at the baby. Other residents spread out, surrounding the remaining thugs before they could react. In a matter of seconds, the situation had completely reversed. Robert found himself in the center of a hostile circle, disarmed, sweating cold, despite the heat of the night. His men were immobilized, and he could see in the eyes of the people around that they weren't bluffing. If he made any suspicious move, he wouldn't leave there alive. "Now," said Jake, leaning on Sarah to remain standing, "let's talk again. You're going to leave here, you're going to go back to Washington, and you're going to tell your father-in-law that Sarah is dead. You can make up any story you want. Car accident, kidnapping, whatever you prefer. But she is dead to you from now on." "And if I refuse?" Robert asked, trying to maintain some tone of defiance in his voice. Daniel raised the camera and smiled. "Then tomorrow all of America will know that Senator Edward Mitchell's son-in-law threatened to kill a baby to hide his father-in-law's crimes. I have everything recorded here." Robert looked around once more, calculating his options. He didn't have many. If he tried to resist, he would probably die right there. If he returned to Washington empty-handed, he would have to face Edward Mitchell's fury. But if the report was published, they would all be ruined anyway. "All right," he finally said, his voice defeated. "But you don't know who you're messing with. The senator has long arms. He'll find you, no matter where you hide." "Let him try," said Martha, hitting her cane on the ground again. "We've been here longer than that family of shits has existed, and we'll be here long after they turn to dust." The thugs were escorted to their cars, disarmed and humiliated. Before getting into the vehicle, Robert turned one last time to Sarah. "You're going to regret this," he said. "When you're living like a beggar in this godforsaken hole, you'll remember what you had and you'll regret it." Sarah looked him in the eyes and, for the first time in years, smiled. A genuine free smile that completely transformed her face. "I've already lived like a beggar," she replied. "Begging for affection, begging for respect, begging for the right to exist without fear. Now I have all that. I have more wealth than your father-in-law can imagine." The cars departed, raising clouds of red dust that shimmered under the light of the flashlights. When the sound of the engines was lost in the distance, the tension finally began to dissipate. But Jake knew that the battle was far from over. Edward Mitchell wasn't the type of man who would accept a defeat easily. Sarah knelt beside him again, carefully examining the wounds. "Now you're going to let me take care of this," she said, her voice firm. "And I don't accept no for an answer." While she and Martha worked to clean and bandage the wounds, Daniel approached with his camera. "When you're ready," he said gently, I would very much like to hear your story. Not just for the report, but because other women need to know they're not alone." Sarah looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked at the baby in her arms, who had fallen asleep despite all the confusion. Finally, she looked at the people around, who had risked their own lives to protect her. "I will tell everything," she said. "Every sordid detail, every night of terror, every time I thought of giving up. And I will also tell about how I found the strength to continue. About how a man I didn't even know taught me what true love is." Jake smiled, despite the pain he felt throughout his body. The physical battle was over, but he knew that the emotional and legal war was just beginning. Edward Mitchell would not give up easily, and there would be more dangers ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt hope. Sarah had found her voice, her strength, her determination, and together they would face anything the future brought. 3 months later, all of America knew the name Sarah Mitchell, not as the perfect daughter of the powerful senator, but as the brave woman who had exposed one of the biggest political scandals of the decade. Daniel Rodriguez's report had been republished by all the major media outlets in the country, and the streets of Washington were buzzing with protests demanding Edward Mitchell's arrest. Sarah was sitting on the porch of the new house they had built on the banks of the Colorado River, breastfeeding her son while watching Jake work with the horses in the corral. He still limped slightly from his right leg, a sequel to the bullet that had been removed 3 days after the confrontation, but he refused to slow down his work pace. He said the pain reminded him that there was something worth fighting for. The baby, now named River, a name chosen by Jake to symbolize life and renewal, had grown strong and healthy. At 3 months, he already smiled when he saw the man he considered his father approach, and Sarah felt her heart warm every time she saw Jake hold him with those large, calloused hands, humming songs in Apache that he had learned from his grandmother. Life there was simple but fulfilling. Sarah had discovered that she didn't need mansions, employees, or social dinners to be happy. Waking up next to Jake every morning, hearing her son's laughter echoing through the house, feeling the heat of the desert sun on her skin while tending to the small garden she had planted. All of this was worth more than any material wealth, but the past still haunted them. Edward Mitchell had been arrested 3 weeks after the publication of the report, but had managed to get provisional freedom through endless judicial appeals. Robert had disappeared, probably fled to some country without an extradition treaty. And although Sarah was officially dead to the family, she knew there were eyes watching, waiting for an opportunity for revenge. The sound of a car approaching made Jake stop what he was doing and look toward the road. Sarah felt her stomach contract. She always got tense when she heard engines, even after all this time. But when she recognized Daniel's blue Jeep, she relaxed and waved from the porch. The journalist had become a dear friend over the past few months. He visited them regularly, not just to follow the unfolding of the case, but because he had developed a genuine affection for the small family he had helped protect. "I have news," he shouted, getting out of the car with a smile on his face. "Good news." Sarah felt her heart race. In recent weeks, the news about her father's trial had been discouraging. Witnesses disappearing, evidence being questioned, expensive lawyers presenting appeal after appeal. Jake approached the porch, cleaning his hands dirty with earth on his shirt. "Speak up, Daniel. Don't keep us hanging." The federal prosecutor's office has just announced that they're going to include Edward Mitchell in Operation Clean Bench, Daniel said, his smile widening. They discovered a money laundering scheme through his ranches. We're talking billions of dollars diverted. That, along with the sexual abuse accusations and other crimes, he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. After years of silence and fear, justice was finally being done. And the other women? Are they safe? All protected by the Witness Protection Program, Daniel replied. And 3 more came forward after you spoke. Your courage gave them strength to find their own voice. Jake climbed the steps of the porch and wrapped Sarah in a careful embrace, taking care not to squeeze the baby she was holding. "It's over," he whispered in her ear. "It's really over." But Daniel made a face, indicating that there was more news. "There's something you need to know. Robert was found dead on a beach in Mexico 2 days ago. Apparently suicide, but the local police have suspicions it was murder." The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah knew her husband was a weak and greedy man, but she didn't wish death on anyone. Even so, she couldn't deny that she felt a dark relief. Robert knew too many secrets, had too many dangerous contacts. Alive, he would always be a threat. Probably his own father-in-law, said Jake, his voice harsh. Men like Edward Mitchell don't leave loose ends. The investigation will show, Daniel replied. But for now you're safe. The Mitchell empire is crumbling, and Edward will spend the rest of his life in jail. That night, after Daniel left, Sarah and Jake sat on the porch watching the stars. River slept peacefully in the improvised crib that Jake had built with oak wood. The sound of the river flowing nearby created a nocturnal symphony that Sarah had learned to love. "What are you thinking about?" Jake asked, noticing her distant look. "I'm thinking about what my life was like a year ago," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "I woke up every morning in a silk bed, in a mansion with 20 rooms, and felt like I was dying inside. Now I wake up in a simple little house with a man who smells of horse and wet earth, and I feel more alive than I ever have." Jake laughed softly, kissing the top of her head. "Don't you miss anything from the life you had before?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I miss my mother," she finally said. "She died when I was 15. Sometimes I wonder if she knew what my father was doing, if she would have protected me. I miss having had a real family, but I never had that even when I lived in the mansion." "You have one now," Jake said, pulling her closer against him. "You have River, you have me, you have the whole community. Martha already considers you a daughter. Did you know that?" It was true. The old midwife had taken Sarah under her protection from the first day, teaching her about medicinal plants, desert cooking, and the ancestral traditions that kept the community together. Sarah had found in the wisdom of that simple woman something she had never found in the expensive books of her privileged education: inner peace. "There's something I've wanted to ask you for weeks," Sarah said, turning to look into his eyes. "Why did you save me that first night? You didn't know me. I was a stranger, a rich woman who could only bring problems. Why did you risk everything for me?" Jake was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the stars. When he finally spoke, his voice was loaded with emotion. "When I was a child, my mother was raped by the son of a rich rancher. She never talked about it, but I heard the women of the reservation talking. The guy was untouchable, protected by the money and power of the family. My mother died when I was 12, taking that secret to the grave. I always wondered how it would have been different if she had had someone to protect her." Sarah felt her heart tighten. "Jake, when I saw you that night, with fear in your eyes and that baby in your arms, I knew you were running from something terrible. And I decided that this time, I would be the person my mother never had. I would protect you, no matter the cost." Tears were flowing freely down Sarah's face now. She kissed Jake with all the passion and gratitude she felt, a kiss that spoke of eternal love and silent promises. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you in a way I didn't know was possible. You saved me in every possible way." "You saved me too," he replied, his large hands enveloping her delicate face. "I was only half living, just surviving. You taught me to live again." They made love that night with a renewed intensity, as if they were celebrating not just the end of the threat that hung over them, but the real beginning of their lives together. In the darkness of the simple room, with only the moonlight coming through the window, Sarah gave herself completely to the man who had become her salvation and her passion. 6 months later, they married in a simple ceremony by the river, with the entire community present. Sarah wore a simple white dress, sewn by Martha herself, and wildflowers in her hair. Jake was radiant in a borrowed suit that was slightly loose on him, but that Sarah thought was perfect. River, now almost a year old, crawled among the guests, drawing smiles from everyone. The justice of the peace who came from Phoenix to perform the ceremony commented afterward that he had never seen a more in-love couple. And when Sarah kissed Jake at the end of the ceremony, sealing their union before God and men, some of the older women in the community commented that even the birds seemed to sing louder. 2 years later, Sarah was pregnant again. This time there was no fear or shame associated with the pregnancy, just pure joy and the expectation of giving River a little brother or sister. Jake had become a devoted father, teaching the boy about horses, fishing, and the traditions of his ancestors. Sarah had also found her purpose, Along with Daniel, she had created an NGO to help women victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse. She used her experience and the resources she had obtained through a judicial agreement, a small part of the fortune confiscated from Edward Mitchell, to offer shelter, legal assistance, and psychological support to other women in similar situations. Edward Mitchell died in prison before completing 2 years of his sentence. Officially, it was a heart attack. Unofficially, some inmates don't look kindly on pedophiles and rapists. Sarah felt nothing when she heard the news. The man who had been her father had been dead to her for a long time. One hot December afternoon, Sarah was sitting under the pecan tree in the yard, watching River play with a young colt that Jake was taming. Her 7-month belly was round and heavy, and she could feel the baby moving vigorously, as if wanting to be born soon to get to know this world of love and security that awaited them. Jake approached, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. At 43, he had some gray strands in his beard, but his eyes still shone with the same intensity that had won Sarah from the first day. "How are you feeling?" he asked, kneeling beside her and placing his hand on her belly. "Heavy, tired, and incredibly happy," she replied, smiling. "I think our daughter is going to be as stubborn as her father." "Daughter?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" "I am," Sarah said, covering his hand with hers. "And we'll call her Hope, because that's what you gave me when I thought there was none left." Jake kissed her softly, a kiss full of tenderness and future promises. There, under the pecan tree, with the sound of the river flowing in the distance and River's laughter echoing through the yard, Sarah knew she had found what she had always sought without knowing, a true home. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky orange and red. Sarah closed her eyes and said a silent prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for having found the courage to run away, for having found Jake, for having found a new family and a new purpose in life. Some love stories, she thought, really are worth all the risks. And sometimes, when we have enough courage to fight for what we want, the universe conspires in our favor. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Jake and River walking toward the house, the boy riding on the broad shoulders of the man who had become his hero. The sight filled her with such intense happiness that it almost hurt in her chest. This was her family. This was her life. And for the first time in her 28 years of existence, Sarah Mitchell, now Sarah Running Wolf, was exactly where she belonged.